morning, everybody. Catherine, what a thoughtful, what a moving, what an inspiring speech. Thank you for that. You raised a whole universe of topics that would probably warrant deep dives over the rest of the day. I think we have to pick a few. You mentioned the relationship between economics and politics. There was a time when politics seemed of less importance to business and financial markets. Since the political system and with it our democracies and our economic systems were largely reliable and stable. There's the saying, it's the economy, stupid. Today we see much more intense and complex interrelation between what is happening in politics and what is happening in the economy on the markets of labor, goods, services, capital, and most recently data. Last year, the CEO of Deutsche Börse, Carsten Kengeter, was standing here exactly on this spot, explaining the benefits of a merger between Deutsche Börse and the London Stock Exchange. And we all know where that stands today, following the UK's vote to exit the European Union. At some point, one of the large UK newspapers headlined, "Fog across the Channel, European continent is cut off." They should have spared that headline for the Brexit decision. So the question is it political risk that now dominates the economy? And Jens, I will pose that question to you in the panel as well, because I think it is very important for investment decisions. Second topic I'd like to talk about is the political leaders will have to come to agreements in very complex negotiations. You made that point very clear. For example, on what Brexit means and how to solve all the open issues to the benefit of whom, by the way? The EU, the individual member states, the non-member states, the economies, the individual people, national voters. So I think you raised that issue as well. Let's maybe dive a bit into the question, who is the target audience of such high-level negotiations between countries or regions? And the third topic, in the past, free trade in an increasingly multilateral, even global economy was seen as the guarantor of wealth creation and customer and voter satisfaction in the past. Recently, the announcement of more protectionist initiatives have gone hand in hand with increases in stock market capitalization. So it seems that the need for effective negotiations between countries or regions is becoming much more important also for our economies. Now let's celebrate how lucky we are with our guest speaker today, who's one of the most distinguished masters in the field of complex inter-country negotiations. It's an honor and pleasure having you here. First of all, because of the remarkable successes that you've achieved in your political career. But second, it is exciting because you have broad perspectives on a whole lot of topics. Sociology, I've seen in your bio, management, politics, security and foreign affairs, economics, trade, and very relevant these days, successful negotiations. So a wholehearted welcome from my side as well. First question. How do you evaluate the current times for political and business leaders in your perspective? You talked about the complexity, you talked about the transparency. Last night we talked a little bit about the pressures maybe some of the leaders are under. What's your view? How do leaders feel these days?
I'm going to stand up because you're standing up. Because you're very tall otherwise, and I can't cope. And these are really great chairs, actually. So when I think about the pressures that leaders are under, I would describe it as this, that if you are a domestic politician, I was not elected, I was an appointed politician, if you like. Not in Europe, I mean in Britain, because the European Parliament did lots of elections around us. But the elected politicians, when they work together, are still domestic elected politicians. I used to say they carry their bag of troubles at home into the meeting that they have with others. And we shouldn't underestimate that the concerns of politicians who are looking mainly, in my experience, to support and help their people, that's why they go into public life, have as their first criteria the support and help that they want to give to their own populations. And then they're in any forum where you are working with others, then into the translation of that into the good that comes from the collaboration that you do. And I still think that's at the core and is fundamental to anything that goes on, whatever kind of negotiation is taking place, or whatever issue is being discussed. You are first and foremost representing the people who put you there. And then secondly, trying to use that and to use the collaborative actions you take, economically or politically, to try and enhance the support you can give your own people and working with others who are seeking to do the same. So in trade deals, and I led the trade deal, the South Korea deal I completed, and opened the Canadian deal and worked to try and resolve lots of trade disputes. You saw nations working together who were thinking about their own industries, and quite rightly. I can remember in the South Korea trade deal talking to the German car industry quite a lot at the time, as you might expect. But the context was of the broader possibilities for the economy, as well as the opportunities for individual industries. So that's, I think, always the problem. And when things get more difficult, those issues become more complicated because populations demand more or expect more, sometimes almost unrealistically, really, in terms of what can be done. And you're trying to manage that as a politician in a broader context, while still trying to deliver the best that you possibly can.
You've been part in the solutions of very complex situations, even crisis situations. You mentioned Iran, you mentioned Serbia and Kosovo. Europe has been very successful in the past and has contributed significantly to growth and wealth and economic stability, regulatory reforms in the financial markets, the banking union, the capital markets union, and others. However, with the current situation in mind, is Europe currently adding stability or rather instability to the world's political and economic agenda?
There's still quite a lot of countries around Europe whose ambition is to get into the European Union. And there are still a lot of organisations around the world that when you look at them, the basis of why they've set themselves up in the way they had is because they've looked at Europe. It is a huge, stable thing. Despite Brexit, the European Union is stable, and I think if any of the major politicians from Britain were here, they would say they want it to be a stable and important thing. There's no desire to see other from the major politicians in the country. And it will continue to have, inevitably, issues internally and on its borders. I dealt with everything outside, but I was conscious of the things that happened within, the financial issues, the questions about how collaboration would work in the future. These are issues that European leaders will continue to reflect upon and to debate and discuss, and that is for them, and rightly so, to do with their populations and with each other. But it is a huge, stable force. And when you go out of it, which I used to do all the time, and you look back on it, it's not quite the pictures from the space station of the Earth, but there is a sense in which you do, unfortunately, because I'd like to have done that, but you do get a sense of what it is and how people look to it and at it. And when we were beginning the days of the foreign policy that was more collaborative and more consolidated, lots of countries weren't sure if we would make it. The joke I used to tell, which I probably shouldn't, but I will, to countries, I remember telling this, I think, first of all, to the Russian foreign minister when I first began, because there was a degree of skepticism about how far this would work, which was that I was the answer to the famous Henry Kissinger question of, I want to talk to Europe, who do I ring? Mm-hmm. But when they ring my phone, they would get my voicemail that would say, welcome to Europe, for the French position, press 1, for the German position, press 2, the Italian position, press 3. And I told that against myself in 2009 because I was making the point that we were at the beginning and not at the end of doing this. And I don't think you would make that joke now, but it was good in 2009 because I was trying to say these building blocks of bringing people together take time. You don't do it in even 5 years or even possibly 10. You have to reflect on it much later on. So it is a hugely important and stable force.
Reflecting a bit on the negotiations that you were in how far do you think it helped at that time that Europe appeared more stable at that time compared to today? Or in other words, what impact does the current instability, as I may call it, in Europe, what impact would that have on similar negotiations, similar to those that you had to go through?
I think there are two different ways I would look at that, and I'll use specific examples because when I look, for example, at the Serbia-Kosovo, and I was recently in Kosovo, I'm conscious that those countries who see the solution to their own instability, which is much more about history and conflict than it is about economic issues. It is about economic issues, but it's also, for them, about guaranteeing their own stability. If you like, the issue that was at the heart of the original project is still very much at the heart of the project for those who have been through war and conflict in recent times. I think they are not probably as sure as they were that the timeframes they had hoped to achieve membership of the EU will be realised. And I don't know, but I wonder whether that will create some sense of instability around us, not in a sense of countries failing or any kind of military conflict. I don't mean that at all. But just the sense of, well, I'm not really sure that this is going to work for us, and to allow those who would oppose their future in Europe to become stronger. And it's a bit of a dilemma because you can equally understand and recognise that until they're ready to be part of the EU, and assuming, big assumption, that EU member states, in whatever method they use, agree that they should be at that point, that is a long process. It's not short, as countries who've joined the EU know. But the direction of travel is what they want to feel. And that, I think, is something that leaders need to reflect upon, is what is the loss that we find if we are not continuing to give a strong message that people should come towards us, maybe to join or just simply to be closer. And that's true, I think, in the Western Balkans. I also felt it in Ukraine when I was in Kiev recently. People are not sure that Europe is there for them in the way it was. And that's no reflection on the foreign policy work, and certainly absolutely no reflection on my successor, who's doing a terrific job, but more the sense of Europe is thinking about other things. And then on the other questions about, if you take the Iran negotiations, what Europe provided to that was, first of all, we were a strong potential economic partner for trade. Partner may be a bit strong, but certainly trade relations would be important. And of course we were carrying out huge sanctions too. And what I think that was recognised in that was that Europe was a force that worked together. I spoke for all nation states of the EU and knew I could with confidence, without question, as well as for the institutions. And I think that would remain. I don't think that's changed at all. I think they've looked at what's happened to Britain, but they're already hearing the messages about collaboration on different issues and so on. And though there's a long way to go, and it won't be for me to be part of any of that, nonetheless, I think they would still see Europe as a strong and clearly important force in that. So I would look at it in those two different ways.
Interesting. I'm thinking of some of the very important negotiations that currently go on between the Eurozone, the EU, Europe as a continent, and other countries, say Turkey, for instance, or Russia. What impact do you think the upcoming Brexit negotiations will have on a European position vis-à-vis Turkey, vis-à-vis Russia, vis-à-vis other countries, other partners on the global stage?
I'm not sure it will have a particular effect, because I imagine that wherever we get to, there will be a lot of discussion going on between the European Union and Britain. We share the same values, we look to the same issues. And one of the things that was incredibly valuable for me was that across the table of 28 countries, we had expertise on practically every part of the globe. And we could rely on that. We could call on those who had a history, sometimes a better history than others, with parts of the world, but nonetheless, there it would be. And also that some countries worried more about others. So if you were in the eastern part of Europe, you would be thinking about Russia more than if you were in the south, where you might be thinking more about North Africa and so on. And that meant you had always got this kind of collaborative sense, and that helped you to find the right approach to how we would develop relations with countries like Turkey or with Russia. And equally, I think we would talk to our partners outside. We would talk to the US quite a lot. In the days of Secretary Clinton, Secretary Kerry, they were my counterparts. We talked to them all the time, or their officers all the time. And I imagine there would be a lot of conversation going on with Britain too. So I don't see that terribly changing. But, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
Okay. You talked about democracy as well in your speech. It seems like it is such an important value. Do we need also in light of the recent elections that we've seen across the globe, do we need to rethink that in light of the UK situation, the US, or even Turkey? Should we believe in Platon's politeia, which basically argues for the power of the few reserved for the wisest? Or should we believe in Aristoteles' Politica, which basically sees every individual as political and looking for the greater good of all? What does that mean for our democracies?
Well, I think people are not stupid. And given information and opportunity, they make the decisions which you may or may not agree with, but they make the decisions that they think are in their and their family's interests. Winston Churchill, I think, said, democracy is terrible until you consider all the other options. He said it more eloquently than that. But this is my point really about deep democracy, which is we in this part of the world have democracies that are deep. They get shaken from time to time. Things go wrong, and sometimes badly wrong. But the underlying framework exists that allows us to get back to what we know to be a better way from every conceivable sense. We sometimes remodel it to give local government more power, or sometimes governments take it away. We remodel our regional operations. We look at how best to develop the links between the administration of government and the parliament. In some countries, parliamentarians become ministers. In others, ministers come from outside, and so on. We've got lots and lots of variations on it. But the main thing for me is that you have deep roots to it. So it can blow and bend, but it's still there. And people can get back to it and rely upon it. There is a sense sometimes that creating, it's always men, I think, strong men, the strong men of Europe, the strong men of the world, the strong men who are going to do things. Well, I'm not so keen on that personally, not just because it's the men, but
I prefer the strong women.
Sure. Well, you've got one here. But the point is that we need that democratic framework to make sure that we don't just end up with slogan politics and the quick fix to things that are by definition deep and long-term issues. And you need to be able to make sure that governments operate within that framework as well, and that the people have their say. So the fundamentals are about the deep democracy that we can't live without.
But we live in uncertain times, and typically uncertain times call for strong leadership. So what role does leadership, both political and business, play in our democracy, specifically maybe in these current times?
Yeah, I think both are incredibly important, but I would differentiate between what I call the strongman kind of ideal and the idea that people are strong and clear. I think that politicians and business leaders need to be brave in saying what they think is important and reflecting on how they see the world. We've always lived in challenging times and difficult times. These are particularly, in foreign policy terms, complicated, but we've really not had a time. We might like to think back and think, oh yes, wasn't it lovely when? But some part of the world would have been going through some crisis or chaos in which we would have been engaged, either as individual countries or as a Europe.
Looking forward to the Brexit negotiations. They will take in a very limited amount of time between the various governments, the various EU institutions, having in parts different priorities, different opinions, different target pictures. It all sounds like a very complex situation. And I know you will not comment on Brexit specifically, but from your experience with multilateral complex negotiations, how do these negotiations work? What are the success factors for those types of negotiations to come to a good outcome?
Yeah, I don't comment on it only because I don't know about it. I mean, it's not for me to deal with it. But I think the principles are the same. And you and I have talked about this, that I describe reaching an agreement as a jigsaw puzzle. If the Iranian foreign minister were here, his eyes would be rolling by now, because I must have said this to him about 1 million times. When you put a jigsaw puzzle together, you can see what the picture is. So you know what you're looking at, whether it's a box of chocolates or a beautiful garden or an Iranian nuclear deal, you know what it is. But the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle can be big or small. They can be rounded, they can have bits sticking out, they can have a bit taken off here. The point is they fit together. And when you are negotiating, you know that the pieces that you begin in your pile may look a bit different by the time you've finished. And sometimes in negotiation, that's a challenge. It was certainly an issue for the Iranian negotiations because the puzzle pieces were important elements of how you reach that sense of security that they're not going to have a nuclear weapon. But if you get a bigger piece here, you can have a smaller piece here. And yet for some people, one piece will be more important than the others. So the idea of making that piece smaller because you've got something bigger is more complicated. The main thing will be that the jigsaw puzzle has to be put together so there is a clarity, not just of departure, but a clarity of what that future relationship looks like. And I think once, in my experience, in negotiations, once you've got the picture clear, people can then work within that and can be certain about what the future is. So look out for the jigsaw puzzle pieces.
I'm asking myself, in the Iranian situation, the final picture, the target was pretty clear. No nuclear weapons in that region. I'm thinking, is that picture and that target clear, as clear as that, regarding the EU and Brexit discussions? I know you can't.
Well, I mean, the answer is, I probably, at this point, I think there are different ways that you could imagine that picture looking. We know what needs to be achieved, I think, but how it's achieved will be for both sides to think about. And for me, the role of the leaders is to, in a sense, is to sort of describe what the picture looks like. You know, so you have the vision thing of, well, we think the relationship should look like this. And once you've got that, then you can start to design what the puzzle pieces look like. But with elections going on in France and now in Britain and so on, I think we have to wait a little while before those discussions will become clear. They may be happening, I don't know, but before they become clear. But that's what you need to look for, is what is the chocolate box picture, sort of. And then it will have different pieces that reflect that, some of which will for some people look better than others. But the main thing is that the picture will be right. But we don't know yet what that will be.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned explicitly the power of these informal groups that contribute to the final solution of negotiations. We have a lot of leaders in the room who I'm sure are members of different formal and informal groups. Do you have any advice for the business communities, for individual leaders, with regards to what they can do in order to contribute to the further success of the European idea and the European cooperation and integration?
Well, the first thing I say to all leaders is good luck. In this audience with so many senior figures in the financial world, I absolutely hesitate to begin to tell you what I think, except I will, because I can't resist it. I think that both in the formal and the informal groupings, the challenge and the objective is to develop and strengthen the economies in support of, whether you call it the shareholders, the business, or the people. It's developing an economy is of huge benefit if done well and properly, and it certainly is done well and properly by the people engaged here. And I think it's a continuation of that. But I also think it's, and I don't think this applies here, but I will say it in a different context slightly, that I've always been struck by business leaders and business audiences who don't engage as much as I think they should in talking to the politicians. I suspect all of you do, so you're not the audience I would be saying that to. But quite a lot of business leaders don't think that's what they should do, when actually politicians benefit hugely from talking to people who are directly affected or indirectly affected, or who simply know things that they don't know by definition. And that, when you do bring that, what I call economics and politics together, even in that way, I think you have a greater chance of better solutions to whatever the problem is or the issue is. As I say, I suspect all of you do. The financial sector is much better than, say, the retail sector. But it's amazing to me how many business leaders I've met over my lifetime who think, oh no, I can't do that. I need to just focus on my business and not think about, in a sense, how a discussion in a political sense would help flow the information that will lead to better decision making.
I interpret that as an invitation for the audience, maybe, to also get into that conversation with the politicians immediately. Should we maybe open the floor for a few questions from the audience?
You're in charge.
I sense great interest. Questions?
Aha.
What would be an intelligent question, in your view?
I think it's a bit much when I have to ask my own questions. There's one down there.
There's one. Very good.
Yes, Baroness Ashton, you mentioned the United States briefly only, but we have a dramatic challenge coming from the United States, in particularly since President Trump has taken over. So what, in your view, with regard to the crisis in Syria, in North Korea, in also Iran, and in Afghanistan, is, in your view, different than 5 years ago?
I think one of the things that's becoming clearer is that it's something we kind of knew, which is that new presidents arrive with aspirations that they then have to trim or temper because the nature of government is different. And when you have a president who has no experience of that world, it is unsurprising that they come in with ambitions that they need to change or think about again. And actually what we've seen happening over the 100 days is a series of moves that have then been faced with the reality of how the different institutions work in the States. So whether it is the countries in the context of bans, whether it is healthcare, whatever, that the White House is having to think again about how to achieve what it wants to achieve, or rethink what it is it actually did want to achieve. So on those particular issues, I think the initial attack after the chemical attacks in America, because I was there at the time, gained the president quite a lot of support. The challenge really for him is you need a broader strategy, you need a plan, and I think that's still something that needs to be worked upon. But that was true also for all of us before that. In terms of Iran, well, the reports coming out so far, and I was in Washington with Dr. Amano, who's the head of the IAEA. We were doing a panel together on the negotiations, and he is absolutely clear that the Iranians have stuck to what they've been told to do and asked to do. And that is the report the State Department have issued. So far, we seem to be moving to continue with that. And on North Korea, the president is engaging with the Chinese, which is exactly what needs to happen. So, although at one level, you know, this is a very uncertain, untried, untested time in relations with the US, some things are moving in the direction that you might have expected them to move with someone who had a clear vision. It may not be your vision, but a clear vision from a position of having been in public office when I was seeing that. And on trade, well, we're back to a trade deal with the EU, the last I saw, which the Chancellor seems to have convinced him of. So, you know, things are sort of, amidst the flurry of everything else, there are some signs that things are coming back into a more traditional stance. I probably regret saying that because something will now happen that will change that, but that's what I think.
Great. Well, then, thank you very much. Is there another question? Oh, sorry, there was another question, sure.
Edouard de Langsin from Paris. You mentioned as a major challenge the European relations with Russia. And because de Gaulle said that Russia was part of Europe. What happened really in our negotiation with Ukraine, where probably we failed negotiating a vision that Ukraine should be a balanced buffer between Europe and Russia, and not have to make a unilateral choice choosing Europe versus Russia. How we can repair that mistake?
Well, I'm not sure. I think that we made the mistake that you suggest. The negotiations with Ukraine went on for 7 years. During that time, there were 14 summits with Russia and 7 with Ukraine, at which the fact of the Ukrainian discussion with the EU was known, and where issues that could have been discussed were generally not because they weren't available to be, but this all went on. There was nothing secretive going on. I think the position that I would say we took, and this is what I told Yanukovych when I went to Kiev as the demonstrations in Maidan had started, was that he was an elected president who had the right to say he changed his mind. But I wasn't the one he had to convince, it was the people outside he had to convince, because he had stood on a platform of doing an agreement with the EU. And I also told him this was not either EU or Russia, it was both and, that Ukraine surely needed a strong economic relationship with Russia, because the east of Ukraine traded heavily with Russia, and their quite old, elderly machinery and old-style industries relied on it. But what Europe offered was reform that would enable it to more easily get international money and investment, that it is a huge potential breadbasket. We could do agricultural reform, which would have been really significant. There was a lot of potential for technology, that Ukraine could have benefited from. And they would have open to them a huge market, which would help to develop that. And for our businesses investing in Ukraine, especially in those areas of technology, agriculture, and others, would be terrific for Ukraine and terrific for us. That was the message we gave him. But the politics surrounding him and what was really going on, which I could spend all day on, but I won't, ended up dominating what should have been a sensible agenda. The point, and the most important point, is it's up to them. It's not up to Russia or us. It's up to them. They chose, and he stood on an election platform to develop a relationship with the European Union. He was elected on that platform. He signed it off. The agreement was initialed. It was technically finished. It was done because they chose to. And it wasn't anybody else's choice, and shouldn't have been, to say, actually, we don't want you to do that, and the way we're going to show you we don't want to do that is in a bad and military sense.
One final question?
As long as it's one I can answer.
Alexander Munich, maybe could you kindly share with us your long-term vision on Europe, how it's going to be look like? Are we talking about the United States of Europe? Are we talking about maybe some kind of a hybrid setup, like giving supranational power to Europe, defense, border control, and giving local powers and authorities back to the local governments? What's your vision on that?
The truth is, I'm not avoiding the question. I don't know. And the reason I say that is because I've sat through many discussions in the European Parliament or in the Commission or in the Council about people's different vision for the future of Europe. And it's partly geography, and it's partly politics and philosophy and ideas. And because governments come and go, one discussion involving some countries 1 year will be different to a discussion with the same countries a year later. And especially if, like me, you chaired 3 councils where you had, which was unusual from a British point of view, we only did it really once in recent times, coalitions. So even in the councils you would have different views because foreign ministers would come from a different political party to leaders, and defence ministers, and you get this in finance of course as well, or development ministers would have a different view again. So it's the richness really of the debate that I think is so important in truth. And you know, the European Union will remain. How big it goes, how many countries come into it, I don't know in the future. I just know there are quite a few that would like to, and maybe there's some logic. I think the Western Balkans is the obvious group of countries, but that's challenging. And I think there are politicians who see that working together more closely and integrating more closely is the answer, and those who don't, who see that it should be looser and more of a more economic focus and political focus. So the reason I don't know is because I don't think they do.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I think it was a little bit of a balancing on the rope, yeah, given the political situation and your previous role in the EU. But thank you very much for very insightful comments and perspectives. I think we all tremendously enjoyed it. And
good. I hope so.
Thank you very much.